History Center. We are honored to have you with us. We're honored to be the stewards of this 1888 church. St. Andrew's Church was consecrated in the late 19th century as St. Andrew's Episcopal Church. It remained in the service of that congregation until it was deconsecrated in 1956. It was abandoned by the diocese and fell into such a grave state of disrepair that by the 1990s, the windows were broken, the roof was leaking, there had been a campfire built on the floor near the front where the refreshments table is now. The doors were hanging off their hinges. It was a candidate for demolition. And that was when the National Football League awarded a Major League Football franchise to Jacksonville, and the owners of that team took an interest in the restoration of this. Dolores Barr Weaver, in collaboration with the City of Jacksonville and the Historical Society, led a campaign to renovate it, and it has been the site of our events since 1998. And it's faithful to the mission of the Historical Society in advocating for historic preservation. It's also faithful, isn't it, to our mission of educating people about the city's past. It's a cliche to say it this way, but man, if these walls could talk, they would tell not just the story of people gathering under this roof to worship, but to experience fellowship with others, to meet people who were new to them, to experience some of the most influential moments in anyone's lives, births, baptisms and christenings, deaths and memorials, and weddings, and the sorts of things that really live in the collective memory of friends and family. Those stories are rich in any church, and certainly in this one, the oldest church in downtown to have survived the Great Fire. We convene these speaker series meetings about once a month, sometimes a little bit more frequently, sometimes a bit less. We aim for each one to help tell an important story about U.S. history in a Jacksonville context. And this is a great city in which to study history. It's only 200 years old, I get that, at least in terms of its existence as a city known by that name. But as you will hear from this evening's speaker, this place that we now call Jacksonville and the region are rich in history that goes a lot further back than that. And that history, those stories, have much to teach us in the present. Knowing something about the place where you live, whether it's your home, your block, your neighborhood, is something that makes all of us better citizens, is it not? The more you know about a place, the more you become invested in it, psychically and emotionally and spiritually and financially. And citizenship breeds a consciousness and a concern for the future. And that's why it's my argument that the value of history and the value of understanding it is not just about looking over our shoulders into the past, but it's about looking ahead. That's one of the reasons why we gather and why we advocate for this public history education in Jacksonville. We appreciate the many sponsors and underwriters who help make these evenings possible. Our corporate sponsors include Haskell, St. John's Bar Pilots, Five Star Credit Union, Crowley Maritime, and many others. We receive support through the Cultural Council of Greater Jacksonville for our events, the City of Jacksonville, which owns this historic building. We depend on the support of a number of local foundations and philanthropies, significant donors and members, I hope, like you. How many are members of the Jacksonville Historical Society? Oh, that's good to see. If there are any, there are a few of you, it's troubling to note, but we can correct that situation. And if you are not yet a member, we have information available at the welcome table, and we would welcome you to membership in the Historical Society at any one of a number of the levels of support that you find appropriate. I'm grateful to the staff and volunteers of the Historical Society that help make these events possible, and also to our board of directors, of which there are some members present. If you are a member of the JHS board and you're not already on your feet, stand up, raise your hand, wave a little bit so that people can recognize you. Thank you very much for being with us. We have some former members of the board of directors present as well. Let's see, one of them notably I see seated next to board member J.F. Bryan. Jeff Bryan, former board member and former board treasurer. Thanks to him for being here. Any other past board members that I'm overlooking? That I'm not seeing through the sun coming through the windows at the west end of the church? Okay. Oh! Thanks for being here. Thanks. Okay, well, with that, I'm going to call on my colleague in the study of U.S. history, Edward Waters, professor of history, David Jamison, also a member of the board of directors of the Jacksonville Historical Society, and the chair of our program committee, and Dr. Jamison will introduce and welcome our guest speaker.
Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming out today. Very excited and intrigued by this presentation today because it's something that many Jacksonvillians have knowledge of and would like someone that's knowledgeable to speak to and about. And we have that person today. An associate professor of history at the University of North Florida, Denise Bossy specializes in global indigenous history. She received her PhD, master's, and MA from Yale University, and her BA from Princeton University. She's a prize-winning author of many articles and book chapters on Florida and the early South, the editor of the book, The Yamasee Indians, From Florida to South Carolina, published in 2018 by the University of Nebraska Press. Get it as soon as you can on Amazon. And the co-editor of the special issue of the Florida Historical Quarterly, Indigenous Florida, 2021. Her current book projects include a monograph on the Yamasees and also an Indigenous History of Northeast Florida, which she is co-writing with archaeologist Dr. Keith Ashley. Dr. Bossy is really the epitome of what you would call a public historian. She actually really cares about teaching this information to the general public. Again, people like us, our job is to teach students who are in front of us, but we want the general public to know this information. So she's a credit to our community, a credit to our field. Please welcome Dr. Denise Bossy.
Because they usually gesticulate a lot. Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to the Jacksonville Historical Society for organizing this talk and for welcoming me and also Mocama and Indigenous history into Jacksonville history. All right, I have no idea how any of this works, so bear with me as we experiment together. So today I'm going to be talking about the Mocama perspective of what happened at French Fort Caroline. And so a lot of what you're going to hear today is going to sound new to you because I'm introducing a new perspective to the story, one that for 461 years has been erased. I'm going to start today by offering a welcome, if I can get the slide to yes, yay. There's someone here who can do a much better job of pronouncing this. But I'm going to offer a welcome in our local Indigenous Tuqua language, and I'm also going to offer a land acknowledgement, and I'll talk about what that means in a moment. So now I wish that Doug would just come up here and pronounce this for me, but I'm going to do it instead. Hita Puenanake Terala Isako Nimane Akala, which essentially I've been told means, welcome, I'm really happy that y'all are here. And one of my favorite things about the Tuqua language group, who are currently reconstructing our local Indigenous language, is that they use y'all a lot, which is very appropriate. This is the Mocama term. And the reason I begin with this, what's that?
It's the nage.
There you go. The reason that I begin with this is to remind us that we are an Indigenous space, and to also introduce you to how exciting research is right now in my field. So not only are Keith and I, Dr. Ashley and I, working really hard to reconstruct our local Indigenous history, but the local Indigenous language has been fully reconstructed. And you can learn Mukwa, which is our local language that the Mocamas spoke. You can do that by going to the Hebwano site, which is an ongoing site, which is growing, which includes lots of lessons. You can teach your children or school children if you're teachers, or you can learn it yourself. So all of this is to reinforce that we don't know everything about our local Indigenous past, and in many ways we're just beginning to understand it. So now I'm going to offer a land acknowledgement, and this is one that I've written for the University of North Florida, and you're welcome to adopt this for your own organizations too. We gratefully acknowledge that the University of North Florida and also the Jacksonville Historical Society are on the unceded ancestral homelands of the Mocama-speaking Tuquas. We recognize that other Indigenous people also built homelands here, including the Yamasees and Wales. For thousands of years, Indigenous people made this region into a vibrant center of diplomacy, exchange, and religious, something that I can't read on my own slide, practice. We pay respect to these nations and to their descendants. We further recognize the historical and ongoing impact of colonization in our region and state, as well as the resiliency of Indigenous people. Today, Florida is home to the sovereign nations of the Seminole Tribe of Florida and Miccosukee Tribe of Indians of Florida, as well as citizens of other Native nations and communities whose ancestors include Mocamas, Yamasees, and Wales. So I begin with this to reinforce that we have a deep Indigenous past, but also we have an Indigenous presence. That Mocamas, Yamasees, and Wales are not gone, that they remain among different nations in the Native South. And this is the place to begin, by situating Fort Caroline in what was an Indigenous world when the French arrived and when the Spanish, too, followed shortly on their heels. Often told from French and Spanish perspectives, I'm going to be adding today the perspectives of the Tuquas-speaking Mocamas, whose territory this was long before and also long after the mid-16th century. And I'm going to do 4 different things today. I'm first going to offer a sense of what this region looked like on the eve of contact, so what made up the Mocama's world in many ways and what would shape how they interacted with the French, and in turn also shaped French and Spanish colonial efforts in the region. I'm going to look at how the Mocamas managed and understood their alliance with the French, identifying 3 different stages of their relationship from Mocama perspectives. I'm going to explain why the Mocama perspective has so often historically been excluded from narratives of Fort Caroline and other colonial narratives. And I'm going to talk about a really exciting website that we are launching right now, right here today, that I hope you share with everyone. So first I want to talk a little bit about what we tend to say our history is when we look at Dakarolin or Fort Caroline. And I'm just going to do this very briefly because it's not the function of my talk today, but some of you may not know this history. And it's something that's very central to our identity as residents of Jacksonville. You can go to the Fort Caroline Memorial today, and you will see this history sort of presented from the French perspective. And you can go into spaces that are similar to what the French would have experienced, although we don't know where Fort Caroline actually was yet. So on May 1st, 1562, 461 years ago today, the French began to explore present-day Jacksonville to identify a suitable location for a potential colony. They stayed for 2 days. On the first day, they made some pretty big gaffes and alienated the major chief of the region, or the Paracusi of the region, by meeting first with sort of a sub-chief. On the second day, they left a pillar on a bluff, we don't know exactly where, in order for future French ships to be able to identify that region as a potential colony spot, and for them to be able to more easily identify where they were coming back to. This has led to a notion that the French somehow claimed the territory as their own, but they themselves recognize this as Mocama territory. And I'll offer some evidence for that as we go on. The Mocamas themselves, especially the Satariwas, who were the head town of the Mocamas at this point, understood that pillar not as a symbol of French territory, because this was their land, but rather as a symbol of French interest in perhaps pursuing a relationship with them at a later date. And this fit into a much longer tradition among the Mocamas and many other native Southerners, the indigenous people of the South, of giving precious gifts when they wanted to start a relationship, when they wanted to acknowledge someone else's power, someone else's sovereignty, or their control over territory, and to perhaps begin to pursue a relationship, which would take a lot of work. So this is what that pillar represented to the Mocamas. So the French are here for 2 days. They returned in 1564, and they've decided that our region is the place to be. That there is probably excellent access to silver and gold, which they see the Mocamas wearing. And I can talk more about that if that's of interest. And that this is a fruitful place where they'll have an easy time establishing a colony. But when they come back in 1564, they are largely a military unit, with perhaps as many as one woman, and a couple hundred soldiers and craftsmen, especially who can build ships, and a fort. They return in 1564 to establish Fort Caroline, and this is where the narrative becomes very French and Spanish usually, right? The narrative says that in August and September of 1565, a second set of French ships come to relieve and reinforce this small colony, and the Spanish come and they wage an epic battle, which the French ultimately lose to Pedro Menendez de Aviles, and they are expelled from the region. The problem with this narrative is that this battle happened in the heart of Mocama territory, and that Mocamas helped to shape the outcome. And that is erased when we don't include Mocamas in the narrative. The Mocamas themselves permitted the French to establish Fort Caroline in the center of their territory, and they played a critical role in that Spanish-French battle and in the decades to come, and even centuries to come, we might argue this remained their homelands. So I'm going to turn now to that Mocama narrative. Where it is best to point this. There we go. I'm going to return now to that Mocama narrative, and that's really what we're going to talk about for the rest of today. So first I want to introduce you to sort of the center of Mocama territory. So this was a well-populated region well before the French arrived. The French and Spanish and other European colonizers sought not depopulated regions that were empty of human beings, but they sought instead regions where there were lots of people. Because indigenous people would serve as guides, they hoped, would serve as translators, they hoped, had access to communication networks, and would be laborers, they hoped, often enslaved people. There's a massive trade building by the Spanish. The French will be involved in it, so too will the English and British. Virtually every European nation will be involved. And between the 16th and 19th centuries, they will enslave collectively throughout the Americas between 2 and 5 million indigenous people. And Florida is part of that story. So I want to reorient us. The French are seeking a deeply populated place, and that's what they believe they find in Mocama, especially sort of Saturiwa territory, which I'll talk more about. So this is a populated place. Indigenous people have well-defined homelands. They absolutely have a notion of territory. They defend their territories. They defend their boundaries. And they permit selectively some people to enter them as diplomats, as ambassadors, and as allies. And so this is not an empty space. Instead, as you can see, even Jacques Lemoyne and other French colonizers will repeatedly acknowledge that they recognize that they are in Saturiwa territory in particular. The territory that's under the control of both a town named Saturiwa and a Paracusi or high chief named Saturiwa. He takes his name from his town as a symbol of the status that he holds. And so we can see that throughout the French documents. So who were and are the Mocamas? First of all, there are Timucua speakers. This is a language map that shows the approximately 10 different dialects of Timucua. Timucua was a language, not a nation, not a singular polity. So there are at least 10 different dialects to this, and then within Timucua, we think there are about 200 to 300,000 Timucua speakers on the eve of contacts in the 15th century or early 16th century, 200 to 300,000 Timucua speakers, and they are divided, as you might imagine, into different towns and into different groups of towns who have alliances. And so the Mocamas are one of these groups. They speak the language of the sea, the Mocama dialect. Mocama means the sea. And they are in a loose type of confederacy. And so the way that I think about the Mocamas, especially when it comes to understanding their relationships with the French, is as defined by both peace and war networks. Their peace networks were really instrumental. Between themselves, all of these different towns, we think there are about 20 different Mocama towns roughly at the time of contact in the mid-16th century. They're all bound together by intricate webs of alliance or peace. And central to these peace alliances are Mocama women. These are matrilineal societies. Women are the heads of their household. Children belong to the clans or haso pare of their mothers, not their fathers. And that takes some getting used to, right? We live in largely still a patrilineal society where many children still take the name of their fathers. In Mocama society, children took the name and identity of their mothers. And women were central to building long-standing peace alliances through marriage and kinship, and also diplomacy and also leadership. The Mocamas and some other Tumukwa speakers had a large number of female chiefs or oladas, a large number of female chiefs. And we see this especially in the sort of later 16th into the early 17th century, a lot of women taking control over the relationships with the Spanish in particular. So women are really central to these alliances, and they really hold this world together. And this matters because the French don't quite get that. They come from a patrilineal society. They emphasize male heads of state. They believe that male heads of state have kind of authoritarian power. They don't recognize that women are really powerful. They also don't recognize quite or appreciate the extent to which there's a lot of politicking, that families play a role in making political decisions amongst themselves, that they collectively then at the town level make decisions, and that those towns then together make decisions about what's going to happen among this alliance of Mocama towns. So it's a much more decentralized political power structure, but they will talk about Saturiwa, for example, the Olada of the Parakusi of Saturiwa, the high chief of that town, rather than women. They're often erased, but we can find them in all sorts of important ways. So I want you to hold on to that idea of women as really important to political networks, because the French don't have women. They're missing women, and that's going to matter. One of the other things that we can see in these internal peace networks is that Mocamas engage in really complex diplomatic rituals that involve multiple different stages. And so, for example, the first time the French come in 1562, they never are allowed into a Mocama town. They're kept on the outskirts, they're kept on the shoreline. They actually don't witness any towns until they get north of here, and they actually invade those towns, and all the people flee. And so they're being kept very much at the margins, and it takes a while for foreigners to be allowed access internally to communities. And that will only happen with the French in 1564, and it will happen on Mocama terms, which we're going to explore. So internal peace among the Mocamas is really supported by ongoing diplomacy, kinship, trade, and also by military alliances. And that last is what's really going to play the big role in their alliances with the French. So they have peace networks, they also have war networks. And these war networks include military alliances among different towns. So the Mocamas we often see functioning together in terms of multiple towns, fielding military outfits. And this is one of the ways in which the Mocamas also define themselves, is through military action, and through a process of confederation. By sharing political goals together, by waging war together against enemies, they become together the Mocamas in addition to their other identities. Right? Mocamas are members first and foremost of those Hasokare, those communities of clans run by women. Then they are also members of towns. And then through military and other forms of action, they also become members of this Mocama Confederacy. And so that's one of the ways in which we see networking also mattering, is even in that war context. For the Mocamas and other regional confederacies like them, because this was a very common political process at the time, these expeditions identified who was in and who was out of their polity, so who was part of them and who was not. And they organized these expeditions by coordinating amongst all the distinct heads of the smaller polities, heads of families, which were often women, always women, but also could include men talking about war, heads of towns, and so there was a collaborative process to war making. War was also quite different for the Mocamas and the French, and this really matters to understanding their relationships. For the Mocamas, a lot of warfare was about reaffirming alliances, reaffirming those confederacies, and also extending their geopolitical control, or just firming it up, defining the boundaries of their nation, defining the boundaries of their towns against outsiders. So it wasn't about conquering new people and places, it was about defining their sovereignty, defining their lands. So all of this is important because the Mocamas fit the French into their world, not the other way around. The French are a couple hundred people coming in, hoping to establish themselves in the heart of Mocama territory. And it's the Mocamas who have the upper hand, and it's the Mocamas who fit them into an older world defined by politics. And one of the central facets of this that we see a lot in the French documents is their ongoing war with the Timagonas, headed by Parakusi Utina. And so we see these names all around Jacksonville, so I'm hoping I'm also telling you things that will help you when you see a road sign, or a gas station named after someone. The Timugonas, we believe, are where the word Timucua comes from. They're Timucua speakers. They speak one of the 10 dialects. And they're very powerful. They're to the southwest of the Mocamas. They are their main enemies. They're defining boundaries and territories between one another, and that's what warfare is largely a function of. And they're headed by a very powerful Harakusi, a high chief, named Utina, whose name basically means something imbued with spiritual power. It can be a person, it can be an object, it can be a place. But he's claiming himself as someone imbued with a lot of spiritual power. So this Mocama duality of peace and war that I've introduced you to, oops, I didn't get to survivance. Let me just back up really quickly. One of the threads that I want you to understand as we move through this is that the Mocamas never stopped existing. That's a story that we've heard in a lot of different spaces. Today, there are at least 2 indigenous nations who openly claim the Mocamas and other local indigenous people from our region as ancestors, and those include the Seminole tribe of Florida and the Muskogee Nation of Oklahoma, the Muskogee or Creek Nation of Oklahoma. And so, as I'm telling you this story, I'm not telling you a story that ends for Mocamas. I'm not telling you a story where they no longer exist, even though we're focusing on a slice of their history. Okay. So I said there are 3 stages to their relationship, and this is the opening stage. Between June and July 1564, when the French first arrived, this Mocama duality of peace and war really shapes relationships with the French. And this is really how the Mocamas understand their alliance with the French, is through this lens. The French, as I said, have almost an entirely male community. It's not until the August reinforcements in 1565 show up that we see larger numbers, significant numbers of women and children. That is a genuine attempt to establish a colony, but they're rebuffed almost immediately. This early encounter really doesn't include women and children to any extent that we know. I should emphasize here that no one's actually done much French archival research, and that's something that I'm going to be starting to do this summer, to really dig into who the French were. But our current understanding is that this is really a militarized group. They come as soldiers on ships to establish a fort, and they're anchoring in Mocama communities. And it matters that they're almost entirely male, because the Mocama establish alliances, especially through women, and the French are missing that. And so what we see throughout the early phase in this stage 1 is the Mocamas repeatedly assessing the French ability to engage in a military alliance, because that's all that they can offer. They can't offer a kinship or diplomatic-based alliance. An alliance has to be mutual. You have to benefit from it. So we see the Mocamas repeatedly assess how well the French can aid them in their military alliance, since they cannot reciprocate in a full alliance that would have women at the center of it. Unable to establish alliances of mutual kinship, the French are left only to do so through military alliances. That's why we see them emphasizing that so much in their documents. The French themselves recognize that they're establishing a satellite in a Mocama world. And this map, which really reconstructs in the 17th century all of the French accounts, shows this. It's very hard to see, but that little red arrow and that little red triangle represent French La Caroline in the midst of an indigenous world, where they are naming all of the different indigenous communities that they encounter. And what this map emphasizes is the extent to which the French have a small satellite community in what is otherwise a Mocama and then bigger indigenous world. And the French recognize that. I call this a satellite community because this comes from also older indigenous traditions or practices of allowing portions of towns, communities, foreign indigenous people to come and live in their own community as sort of ambassadors to establish an alliance. And this is quite frequent. We see this go on for centuries after this. That there will be parts or whole entire communities that will briefly live among foreign indigenous people. They'll move to a place like Mocama, establish a town, and develop kinship relationships usually, because they usually bring women and children, and that those create really deep alliances that are both diplomatic and kinship-based. So this is how the French are being slotted in. They're being allowed to establish this temporary community. Those very rarely turn into permanent communities, although sometimes they can. But it's at least a temporary community with a diplomatic military component to it. So what does this alliance look like? It's very clear that the Mocamas understand this as a military alliance. They engage in 2 ceremonies with the French. They're the ones that organize these ceremonies, and they guide the French through them. So in the first ceremony, early on in this first phase, the Mocamas under Saturiwa, under that Paracusi or high chief, arrive at Fort Caroline with about 800 men. They're, quote, carrying their weapons as they usually do when they're about to go to war, the French say. There are 50 young men carrying spears, 20 pipers playing, Saturiwa at the head of this with his religious and political counselors, and then about 800 soldiers with him. And the French are terrified. They think that they're about to be attacked. There's no way they can survive this, right? They are sure that they're about to be attacked, but instead, Saturiwa has come to talk terms. After a round of gift-giving on both sides, the French agreed to a, quote, pledge of friendship and everlasting alliance. Saturiwa inspects French military arquebuses, their early layout of the intended fort, and then agrees to provide the French with some assistance in completing that fort. And throughout their stay, Saturiwa and other Mocama leaders repeatedly come to remind the French of the terms of their military alliance, that they are to ally with them and war against their enemies. And they repeatedly remind this. At the second ceremony, the French are invited into Mocama town. They're getting deeper into this alliance at Malacca, which is 3 leagues from Fort Caroline. The Mocamas have been misled by the French to believe that they've actually already attacked their enemy, the Timagonas. And the Olada of Malacca, right, the chief of Malacca, opens with a ritual with the French. It's almost like a performative play. It's several hours long, and they reenact their war against the Timagonas. And they do this with a weapon that has been used to kill their ancestors in the past by the Timagonas, and they reenact the murder of a beloved kinsman, with women weeping as this all happens. And this is to instruct the French in just how deep this enmity, this war goes, and to bring the French into the emotional component of this, that they have lost loved ones, and that the French are now allied with them against them. But already the French have begun to violate the terms of the alliance. They have not warred against the Timagonas. Instead, they've started to ally with them because that very powerful Parakusi Utina, who claims to be himself imbued with spiritual power, has told them that he has better access to gold and silver in the Appalachian Mountains geography, and that he can take them there, and that this is what the French are interested in. Oops. So we now enter the second stage, which I call Things Fall Apart, for the wonderful Chinua Achebe novel. On 2 separate occasions, in August and January, first in 1564 and 1565, the Mocamas wage war against their longtime enemies, the Timagonas, and call on the French to join them. This is the foundation of their alliance. The first time, Saturiwa and 10 other chiefs launch a 2-pronged assault on the Timagonas and return with Timagona captives, and the French refuse to go. And instead, when they return with captives, the French force them, the Mocamas, their allies, to give over to the Timagona captives, because they want to use them to establish a better alliance with the Timagonas. The Mocamas say, no, these are our captives, you didn't join in the war. And Laudonnière, the head of the French, René de Laudonnière, confronts them with 20 soldiers and seizes the captives by force. So first show of military force against their allies. Saturiwa learns from this exchange not to trust the French, and he starts receiving news that the French have allied with Tina and the Timagonas, and is joining battles with the Timagonas under Tina against their enemies instead. So when a second assault happens, Saturiwa goes once again to the French and says, you need to join us in this major assault on the Timagonas, our enemies, your enemies, and demands that the French withdraw their people, who are now some of them living among the Timagonas as well. And the French refuse. So this is going bad. Right. Stage 3. This is when things really unravel. The French refuse both times, and so the Mocamas withdraw food and other forms of assistance. And one of the things that's critical to understand is that the French depend on the Mocamas for information, because they don't have their own networks, there's no news, right? There's no radio, there's no TV. The way you find things out from people is by having active networks to others. The Mocamas have that and the French do not. The other thing to understand is that the Mocamas have decided where the French are going to settle. And they have picked a spot that no Mocamas live in on purpose. It doesn't have a marsh. It doesn't have good access to local food resources. So the French persistently depend for food for their survival on the Mocamas on purpose. They are a satellite town, and the Mocamas are overseeing them and ensuring their dependency on them. It's part of their strategy. So progressively, the French begin to starve. They find some Mocama leaders willing to trade with them at extortionate prices. That's how the French interpret it, but there's a great risk to giving food, even trading food with enemies. So it's, that's what the price tag represents. By May, the French have convinced themselves, quite rightfully, that they cannot stay, that they cannot repair their relationships with the Mocamas. And they resort to stealing. They steal food at first, and then they begin to steal Mocama and also Timagona leaders. At one point, they kidnap Utina himself and say to his people, you can have your Parakusi back, your high chief back, if you give us food. And they say, that's okay. we got other guys and other women. We're good. So that falls really flat. By July, the French under Laudonnière have decided that they cannot stay. They have so ruined their relationships with the Mocamas that they begin to take their own fort apart and to build a ship to leave, big enough to take everyone back. And it is at this stage, in August, just the next month, when the French reinforcements arrive. Laudonnière says to Rigaud, right, that Jean Rigaud, the captain of the French reinforcements, we cannot stay here. And Rigaud is much more concerned about the Spanish. He hasn't lived in this world with the Mocamas. He hasn't watched the French destroy those relationships. He hasn't watched the Mocamas withdraw all of their assistance. And he says, no, we're fine. I just have to worry about the Spanish. And this is when the Spanish arrive, in September of 1565, when the relationships have completely broken down between the French and the Mocamas. And this is why the Mocamas don't tell the French that the Spanish are coming. And this is a big part of why Fort Caroline falls. So when we add Mocamas to the story, it really changes, right? It really changes how we understand who the French were, where they were settling, and why this battle between the French and Spanish was really shaped by Indigenous people too. So I want to turn a little bit to thinking about why we have narratives like this one that exclude the Mocamas and other Indigenous people. So the reason, in part, is because our stories have been so focused on some but not all of the players. Right? I'm presenting to you a narrative where the Mocamas are major players, major actors in this. So, for example, John McGrath's otherwise wonderful study of the French in early Florida, which some might consider the definitive study of early French settlement in the region, uses the word Indian 11 times in the entire book. It's a wonderful study of the French and Spanish, but it doesn't attempt to do anything with Indigenous people whatsoever. Our national memorial, established in the 1950s, is also offering a really interesting narrative of the French, but too excludes Indigenous people because when it was established, that was the intent, was to focus on the French and not on Timucuas, not the Mocamas in particular. So we have this sort of legacy, but the legacy goes further back. There are three reasons why we exclude the Mocamas and other Indigenous people from our narratives. The first is what one scholar has called the problem of firsting. Have you ever heard someone say, this is the first place where this happened? And does it usually involve Indigenous people? No. Does it usually involve people from any other community other than a colonial one, or a colonial descended one? It does not usually. So it's a problem. The problem of firsting goes back to the 19th century. So there's a great book by Jean O'Brien, if you're interested in this, called Firsting and Lasting, where she looks in early New England at this phenomenon. It comes with the establishment of local historical societies in the late 19th century in places like New England, and our region too, in the early 20th century in places like Jacksonville, where these are established by people generally trying to reconstruct the histories of their spaces, but how they handle Indigenous people is very problematic. All of the firsts are European. All of the lasts are usually Indigenous, firsting and lasting. And we have these replacement narratives where Indigenous people appear for a little bit in the story, and then they're very quickly sideswept, and the real history begins when the city is established. The real history begins when other people are doing the firstings. So we have this legacy in our region too. I taught a wonderful seminar at the University of North Florida where students read Jean O'Brien's book and said, we want to do this with Jacksonville and St. Augustine. So that's what we did. So in St. Augustine, for example, I had one student write a great master's thesis on the Juan Ponce de Leon celebrations that started in the late 19th century, which were pageants where this firsting and lasting was on full display. And we also see it in publications that come out of the establishment of the Jacksonville Historical Society, for example. And I offer here, if you've ever read this book, then look for First. And The number of firsts are amazing, right? The first post office, the first street, the first church, the first everything. And this firsting erases a lot of other people from the story. So that's the first reason why we don't have more Indigenous-centered histories in our region. The second is the problem of geography, how we imagine the past geographically. So this is a map by one of my colleagues, and it's beautiful. It's Spanish-Florida borderlands from 1670 to 1763. And who is missing? Who do you think is missing? I just talked about that for a very long time. This is not a quiz. All of the Indigenous people. This is a map that erases everybody who lives here. The majority of people who live here are erased in this map. This is actually what the Native South looked like around the mid-17th century. So about a century after we're talking about. And this is a wonderful map by another colleague. If you look closer at Florida, it looks like this, right? But if you looked at that first map, we just see a few settlements on the coast, and that's it. So part of the problem is geography, how we imagine the past geographically. And when I teach my students about our local Indigenous history, they often feel like they're in this foreign land. They can't even pronounce any of the names, and it's an overwhelming sort of sea of difference. The final problem is a problem of chronology. Oops, I don't know why it's not showing up. Well, anyway, there's supposed to be a box. Here. Problem of chronology. If you go into most museums in our local region, you'll see the flags, right? And there's never a Mocama flag. You'll see a timeline, and the timeline starts at 1562 or maybe 1513. But in fact, our Indigenous history is much deeper than that. So if we took the whole history of human habitation in our region and did a little math, which I'm terrible at, but Keith checked it, so I know it's true. He's an archaeologist, and they do like science and stuff, and statistics. Then 97% of our local history is actually Indigenous, which transforms those timelines, which transforms those flags. So part of it is chronology too, where we start our history. So 461 years later to the day, we're finally telling them of Homicide of Historia. I have not done this work by any means by myself, and I'll be thanking lots of people. Right now, we are launching an Indigenous Fort Caroline walking tour, where you can take your phone, you can go to this website right now, you can take your phone, and you can walk around Fort Caroline. We have a map, and you can see that world from Mocama perspectives. Some of what I've talked about today, but some other things too. There's much more information than I provided today. I hope that you use this. I hope that you share it with everybody you know. We will be adding to the site over the coming months and years. This is part of a much bigger project where we are really exploring the full, rich, deep, and local Indigenous history. Keith and I are writing a book together. We're also building this digital humanity site together. So we launched that today. For you in honor of this day with me speaking. We've taken this opportunity. So I wanted to talk about where this project on Indigenous Fort Caroline fits into our larger history. So this started really with Keith and I recognizing that there's a gap in our local history and trying to fill it first through teaching with our students. We designed a permanent museum exhibit that's now at the Jacksonville Beaches Museum. That is, I think, the finest local exhibit on Indigenous history. We're going to load a digital version of that onto the site that I just showed you in the coming weeks. That will come up next. We also then taught another class where we began to build a digital humanities site with our students, and we have many other tours in addition to the Fort Caroline tour, but we decided to start with that one first and to test it out with you. So please give us feedback, please use the site, and please let us know what else you're interested in learning. We have other projects that we're also working on. One of the things that you might have noticed, one of the things that you might have noticed is that I did not use a single Theodore DeVry engraving in this entire talk. When you go to when you go to local museums, you're going to see lots of that because those are the images that we believe we have from the 16th century of Indigenous people. Theodore DeVry was never here. The belief is that Jeff Lemoyne, who was a map maker, photographer, and also an artist, who was here actually with Fort Caroline, painted some paintings, and that DeVry eventually purchased them and made engravings. The problem is that they're highly inaccurate. DeVry's role was not to create photographs. He was not interested in creating really accurate images of Indigenous people. He was a Protestant Flemish engraver who was very interested in promoting Protestant colonization of the Americas in part by enticing people through cartoon-like images of Indigenous people that did not try to be accurate. But many people use these like they're photographs. So I've offered some examples of how more modern art contradicts what we see, right? So if the DeVry engraving on the left is completely inaccurate, this more modern painting is much more accurate. So Dr. Ashley and I, Keith and I, are very lucky that the University of North Florida's Board of Trustees has just awarded us a huge grant, and this is a very huge historian, $25,000, which is like so much more in history money, like $1 million. Thank you so much for $25,000. And we're going to be teaching a course with students where we go through the DeVry engravings in the spring, select some, and partner with Indigenous artists to have them do more accurate versions. And we will make those free and available for anyone to use so that we begin to get some of these inaccurate images out of our local museums and replace them with more accurate ones in partnership with Indigenous communities like the Muskogee Nation and the Seminole Tribe of Florida. So that's coming. I want you to take a few things away from this. I want you to hopefully recognize that the French and Spanish, I didn't talk a lot about the Spanish, but when they arrived in Mocama, they similarly have a small hub in what is a much larger Indigenous world. I also want you to take away that the Mocamas played a central role, as did many other Indigenous people, in shaping colonial events, including the collapse of Fort Caroline, and that including the Mocamas results in a much more accurate and complete narrative of our local past. And finally, that the Mocamas survived well beyond the 16th, well beyond the 17th, well beyond the 18th centuries to the present. They are claimed as ancestors of the Muskogee Creeks, the Seminoles, and many other citizens of modern-day Indigenous nations who still exist and have a lot of power in our nation, but are fighting for that power. I also want to take a moment to thank my many partners. This project could not have been, I could not have achieved this without so many other people. Most important was Amarilla Sanchez. I don't know if she's here. Amarilla, are you here? Can you stand up? I'm so sorry. Can everybody clap? She's going to be so great. Is a phenomenal master's student at UNF. She completed her master's, in fact, 2 years ago? 1.5 years ago? 1 year ago, but has stayed on and has worked side by side with me on this project. On Friday morning, our entire project was erased. The most recent version was erased, and it wasn't backed up, and we all made lots of mistakes. And Amarilla's helped me rebuild it over the weekend. So we had prior versions, but we lost a lot of work. But she helped me rebuild it, and according to our tech folks, it looks better than ever. So I could not have done any of this without her. I also want to thank Dr. Keith Ashley and the UNF Archaeology Lab. We also have 3 other students who played a fundamental role in this. This project started as a master's student project where I said, hey, do you guys want to do Indigenous Fort Carolina walking tour? And they were like, maybe. And I was like, don't you really want to do it? And they said, yes, that sounds great. So Emily Cottrell is here, who works at the Jacksonville Historical Society, and also Laura McNeil. Language group, which includes Doug Henning, who is here too as well, who reconstructed Tumukwa. Doug is a local math history teacher who has taught himself numerous languages, including Tumukwa, and is fluent in that. How lucky are our kids? I also have many other supporters. The chair of my department is here, Dr. David Scheffler, who's been really supportive. Michael Boyle is really supportive. University of North Florida, and I'm going to make a pitch for your money. That grant is amazing, but it only goes so far. So if you're interested in supporting local Indigenous history, please consider donating to us. We do a lot with that money, and we're going to be continuing to build everything that we possibly can that is public facing. So I'm happy to take questions. I know I've run a little bit over, and I just thank you for coming and listening to me today. And what your responses and your questions help me do this better. Right, help me shape public history. This is essential for me to hear your feedback, here or somewhere else or after the talk too. And feel free to email me at any point. Yes, questions. Thank you. Yes.
You indicated it was a matriarchal society, but yet the 2 leaders that dealt with the French were men, of both indigenous groups. How do you reconcile that? And what was the estimated population? And how do you know the language is spoken anywhere accurately?
So those are 3 questions. I hope I remember them all. So the language has been reconstructed through a series of Spanish Catholic texts that we've known about for a very long time, but that were ignored. It's the second largest corpus of indigenous languages in North America, second only to the Massachusetts language. And so we've got all of that, and that's been reconstructed through hard work by people like Doug. He's done that work. And one of the fascinating things about that language project is for a very long time, scholars thought that the Franciscan missionary, Pareja was the one who did all the translating. And more recently, Dr. Broadwell, who's done a lot of the work on this at the University of Florida, he's the primary linguist in charge of this project, has discovered that Pareja was not fluent, made a lot of fundamentals for easy grammatical errors, and that the really fluent scholars at the heart of this community were indigenous people. And they were largely Mocamas, who are on Fort George Island and elsewhere, and this is where Pareja was stationed. And so the main translators in this project were Timucua, native Timucua speakers who were much more fluent in Spanish than the Spanish were in Timucua. So the language has been fully reconstructed. And again, you can go on a website and start to...
It's very rare to reconstruct an ancient language.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's only because we have this enormous corpus. It's huge, a huge amount of material. So that's a very exciting project. These matrilineal communities represented a balance of women's power and men's power. So some, many chiefs or oladas or Paracusis high chiefs were men, but we also do see a lot of women taking on that role, but also women are the heads of their households. And the French are paying attention to men because they believe men have power. So they're not talking about women, and they're also not talking to women because they don't have access to women's worlds. And so they're excluded from those worlds, and they also ignore them. So that's how I sort of explain that duality. And I'm so sorry, what was the question?
What do you think the indigenous population number was when the French came? And also, finally, there is a brewery named after the tribe in Fernandina.
Yes, of course there is. Yeah, I've drunk their beer, and it's okay. I like wine. And very nice cocktails. So estimates are that the Timucua-speaking population at contact was between 200,000 and 300,000 people. We don't have good census records for any indigenous communities. At any point, the census records, when they're gathered, are gathered by a European census taker who goes into an indigenous community and says, oh look, there's about 200 people here. But missing are perhaps a portion of the community that's decided not to be there that day or is doing something else. So we don't have really accurate census records. But the Spanish certainly took a lot of census records of the Mocamas later on, and we can see those people who are willing to be counted by the Spanish being counted. Those who are not being counted. But that's the estimate at contact for all of the Timucua speakers. Yes?
How do the French and the Spanish initially communicate?
With Timucua speakers? Yes, that's a very good question. They believe they're communicating a lot. So the French initially believe they're communicating through signs. And there's a lot written on French interpretations of signs. Like when people are yelling at them, they believe they're greeting them very happily to be here. And that fits into the larger history of the way in which the French sort of integrated everyday people into their processions, especially for the accession of a new king. So there's been a lot of great work done on that. We know that the Mocamas use multiple different types of languages, so they spoke. They also drew. They also used tattooing. They also, I think, had a whistle language, because there's some hints that they had that too. So the communications are hard at first. What the French and Spanish often do, and the English too, is kidnap people to try to compel them to serve as translators. So a lot of the early accounts, when you're reading that the French are reading signs, so there's this whole exchange where they believe the Mocamas are teaching them that they believe in, the sun and the moon as the main sort of sources of spiritual power. So a lot of it's misinterpretation at first. But then we do start to see, both on the Mocama side and the French side, linguists beginning to develop some ability to communicate. And the Mocamas in particular, and most other natives, all of their native Southerners, had expertise in learning multiple languages because they lived in multilingual communities already. So they already had professional orators whose job it was to actually serve as...
Question first.
Why did the Mocamas fight along the French? They don't. They don't, yes. No, they just let the Spanish go right in. Go right into Fort Caroline. The doors open, and it's sort of partly demolished. So they don't. So one of the questions would come later. So the French in 1568 come and try to, under sort of an unofficial voyage, try to come and enact some revenge against the Spanish, because the Spanish do slaughter most of the French who don't escape from the fort, and then a couple of other different communities too further south who fled and shipwrecked. It's a much more complex story than I'm giving. And then the Mocamas do side with the French in 1568. In both cases, they're doing strategic alliances to get rid of enemies they don't want living in their lands, right? So they allow the Spanish full access to Fort Caroline. They don't warn the French. The Spanish can get rid of the French. And then similarly, when the French return, the Spanish have been waging a war to claim that former site of Fort Caroline. And so the Mocamas now ally with the French to try to get the Spanish out too. So it's really all has to do with what their political agendas are. That's a great question. Yes, go ahead.
I had a question about racial formation. So 40, 50 years later, when the English were coming in further north, some sources I've read show that when the English encountered Native Americans, they first thought that they may have been the lost tribes of Israel, or various different narratives were constructed to account for who these people were. And only over time, when the Native Americans would not cooperate with their sort of cultural assimilation scheme, did they begin to racialize them and to see them as a different race and speak in terms of skin color. What went on? Do you see anything in the French records or maybe the later Spanish records in terms of the people here in Florida and the sort of identification of a racial other?
So race as a construct doesn't exist in the 19th century. Race as a pseudoscientific construct really doesn't exist until the 1820s, 1830s is when we really begin to see it. So even the British earlier who arrived were English at the time and Scottish. And the Union of 1707 who arrived in South Carolina, for example, do not come with a construct of race. That we would recognize as a modern pseudoscientific construct of race, which we no longer, which we understand now to be false and created. So I can't do the 16th to the 19th century in 2 minutes, but what I can say is that in the 16th century, not only the French, but the Spanish and the English too paid a lot of attention to clothing and hair and body art and body jewelry as a symbol of status. And the French talk a lot about the ways in which the Mocamas change the way they look at different points. And that's a token of stability, right? That you fashion the way that you look. And there's great work actually on the early English in Virginia on that by Karen Ordell Kupperman. If you want to read earlier stuff in the English in Virginia, it really looks at that. But the evolution of racialized notions, is really through the lens of enslavement. And so you have to look at a lot of slave codes to begin to see that codification of slavery over time, which also becomes very gendered. And so that would require quite a comparative study of sort of enslavement of indigenous and African people to understand the beginnings of racialized thinking, really in the 17th century. We need to push it into the 17th century. Yes, but you're welcome to take any class. I do a lot of work on race, the creation of race, and the creation of different religions. Yes?
Philosophically, women were more dominant in society, Western society, philosophically, how do you think that's relevant?
Philosophically, how do I think?
How do you think they have the difference between female society organizations and natural
They're asking tiny questions. I wish they were bigger. So he's asking me to do a comparative analysis of the creation of matrilineality and patrilineality from a philosophical perspective. 90 seconds or so. Because the Mocamas are smart. My answer. But I'm happy to talk more about it. I don't have an easy answer for that. That's really like a global history question. I'd be happy to talk more about it. So I'm going to go with the Mocamas and clever. Recognized how central women are to society.
In regards to the Mocamas, was there any documentations of how they felt about when the Spanish came in regarding trying to convert them to Catholicism?
Yeah, absolutely. So that corpus that is the foundation of reconstructing the language is entirely Catholic texts, where we see Mocamas sincerely engaging with Catholicism, thinking about Catholicism, thinking about the dramatic philosophical historical differences in the underpinnings of these societies and really grappling with them. To understand how Mocama's recognized and discussed amongst themselves Catholicism requires you to also go back to at least the 11th century and to understand the ways in which they're part of a world where discussing religion, where changing religion, adapting is part of a long practice among indigenous people, right? That they already are theologians, they already think about religion a lot, they already engage in a lot of religious practices. And so they fit the Franciscans into that, right? Many Mocamas reject them, some engage very sincerely with them, and some, incorporate elements of Catholicism but remain Mocamas. I mean, that's what they don't want you to take away. That we often tell narratives of conversion that are overly simplistic, that assume that, one Franciscan living in a community of hundreds of people, eating Mocama food, living in a Mocama-built house, that he is able to somehow transform fundamentally all of their beliefs, which are passed down from generations. And that's just not realistic, and it's not accurate, and it also fails to understand how the Mocamas shaped and changed Franciscans too, who are living in a Mocama world. So it's a much more complicated story, and it's less about conversion and more about religious exchange. And then you have to add to that the fact that the Franciscans understand themselves to be and are colonizers, and are interested in Mocama labor. There's a major exploitation of Mocama labor that comes through the Franciscan labor system, the Franciscan mission system that is intimately tied to St. Augustine and ultimately the crown. And so the story is much more complicated. We have to look at all of the factors involved. But Mocamas don't simply transform themselves into Catholics and forget all of their centuries of religious exchange and belief. Instead, I think most fit elements of Catholicism into their religion, and change is part of being Mocama. And changing is part of being indigenous. There's a wonderful phrase that comes from a Seminole today, that the Seminoles are modern by tradition. That it is traditional to change. And it is traditional to stay the same as well, to innovate, to modernize. Does not somehow make you less indigenous. So to incorporate elements of Catholicism didn't make them any less Mocama. It made them modern by tradition. So thanks for that question. Yes, in the back.
When might the book that you and Dr. Ashley are working on together?
I'm so sorry. Wait. Oh, the book. What were you asking about the book? What is it?
When might the other?
Oh, Dr. Ashley, when are you finishing the book? We've been working on the book. This is part of the book. I have a big project that I'm finishing up right now in the Yamassees, a huge book that's in developmental editing. And then come the fall, I'll be focusing a lot on this book. So as fast as we can write it. But I would think it's going to be a couple of years at least. It's going to be a public-facing book that reflects brand new scholarship by Dr. Ashley and I. He's the archaeologist and historian, so it's going to have cutting-edge archaeology and history. It's going to be an entirely new, seamless, deep narrative that goes back more than 6,000 years to the present, but it's going to be nice and short. I don't know how I'm going to do that. My current book's like this big, I'm going to write this big. So as soon as we have it, you will know. Yes.
Now, this is very confusing to a layman. I always thought we were in Alabama County territory.
Yes.
And the map shows them, I guess, north of the St. John's.
Yes. So.
And how do you differentiate between them?
I think we might need to repeat that one.
Okay, so he's asking about the Alamaquanis. Dr. Ashton knows a lot about the Alamaquanis. The Alamaquanis are a Mocama community. Later, I don't think we see the name this early, do we, Dr. Ashley?
Yes.
We do? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're in the center. We just sliced out the kind of middle, well, really the middle southern part of southern Mocama. We don't have the entire map to show.
Or are they just separate groups